Good afternoon, everyone. This is David Cleaves. I'm with the Forest Climate Working Group in American Forests, and you are listening and viewing the Forest Climate Working Group Learning Exchange 2019 series. This is the first session in that series. I'm standing in today for Lauren Cooper from Michigan State University, who couldn't make the call today. She's out of the country. My hired in research and development and was the climate change advisor for the Forest Service before my retirement. Now I work with American Forests on a contract basis on a number of different forest climate and carbon issues. And we are really pleased today to kick off this 2019 Learning Exchange series with you today, 2019 and 20. So this and future sessions of the Learning Exchange series will be hosted by the Forest Carbon and Climate program at Michigan State University. That's Lauren Cooper and Lauren Lucas, who's behind the scenes, basically making sure that I do what I'm supposed to do, is host today and supporting all of us with her great expertise with the whole system. As I say, Lauren Cooper is usually the host, and we'll be back in the next session. But as you look at the series here in full, this series is brought to you by the Forest Climate Working Group, which is a diverse group, national group of about 47 forest organizations and interests, including landowners, industry, conservationists, academia, and those active with the carbon markets. And this group has worked together for almost 10 years now to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest management and keeping forest as forest. We are currently in the process of invigorating our focus and our activities, and this learning session series is a part of all that. So if you have comments or questions about Forest Climate Working Group, the Learning Exchange series, or you think you might be interested, or your organization might be interested in joining the Forest Climate Working Group, please get a hold of us at any time at the Forest Climate Working Group on the website, or the folks at Michigan State University Forest Carbon and Climate Program. So today's speakers are Luke Nave, who's an associate research scientist at the University of Michigan and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, also known as NIACS, and Kendall DeLyser, who is the forest and climate manager at American Forest. Luke and Kendall will be presenting Forest Soil Carbon Partnership, assessing management impacts, vulnerability, and policy implications. And this is going to be an exciting kickoff to this series, because we're diving into, with this presentation, a look at soil carbon, which often doesn't receive as much attention as it should in all of our discussions on the science or even the policy side about forest carbon. Because a substantial portion of both the forest carbon and the forest carbon stock change occurs in soil carbon. And this offers us a chance to zoom in on this important part of our forest carbon estate. So before I hand the mic, so to speak, to Luke to kick us off here, just a couple of housekeeping details. First, to receive registration details and information regarding this upcoming webinars beyond this one, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our mailing list. I noticed that some of you had registered for this clear back in September. That means you probably already received that and are using that as a look ahead for your calendar. So if you'd like to be on that mailing list, that would be great. And that attendees today are qualified to receive one continuing forestry education credit, CFE credit, from the Society of American Foresters. So those of you who are interested in this credit, please reach out to Lauren Cooper or Lauren Lucas at forestc@msu.edu. This session and all the sessions is being recorded and will be posted on the web, along with any supplemental resources such as presentation slides and questions and responses in the next week or so. So if you've registered, you'll receive an email letting you know when and where to find it. The session will be followed by a Q&A, question and answer component. So on the Zoom interface, you will see the word chat and a little drop-down triangle next to it. And here you can offer up questions at any point during the presentations, and we will compile and then present those questions to the speakers in the Q&A session, time permitting. So I will be organizing the questions as they come in and try to send them and facilitate them back out to the speakers in some kind of logical fashion. We will be going for a hard stop at 4 o'clock because we respect your time. Those questions that we don't have a chance to get to before 4, we will be putting them into the material that's put up on the website, and you will have a chance to see how those questions were answered. And we'll work with the speakers to have them addressed and put in a document to be shared with the presentation material. So with that, Luke, would you please share your screen and begin your presentation? And Luke will be sharing the screen then with Kendall for her part of the presentation. So you won't be hearing my voice, probably better for you until the question and answer session. So Luke, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And thank you to the Forest Climate Working Group and the Michigan State Carbon and Climate Program for the opportunity to present this webinar to you. This webinar, it sounds very broad, Forest Soil Carbon Partnership. It's actually a project that Kendall and I have kicked off within the last year with a focus on Maryland. And the reasons for that will become clear during our talk. A very quick background on the organization I'm representing here, NIAX. Hopefully most of you are familiar with NIAX, led by Chris Swanston and Maria Genoviak. We are an organization that delivers science and services related to climate and the carbon cycle to stakeholders interested in incorporating these aspects into their planning and management. There's plenty to learn about NIAX at niax.org if you're interested in that. A little bit about the programmatic background of this carbon trends and management work that NIAX does. We've been working on soil carbon management for more than 10 years now. We've been trying to funnel the state of the science down from the abundant big picture generalizations that exist in research circles towards more localized applications. NIAX has an extensive network of stakeholders who are doing projects on national forests with privately held 40s. It scales more like that, where you really cannot take generalizations that researchers like me keep pumping out into the peer-reviewed literature, people who need more specific information. What we've been trying to do is work from these broad level reviews down towards down from the 100,000-foot view to the 5,000-foot view, and ultimately the landscape and even project level. Really briefly.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. We are still seeing my screen. Somebody popped in the chat. I don't know if you could pull the screen share away.
Okay. Got
Sorry,
it.
I don't want to. That looks great. Sorry,
okay.
Keep going.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't click the last button. Okay, you haven't missed much. I want to keep it moving at the early part of the talk. I wanted to provide some appreciation for where NIAX has come from as we have worked towards this forest soil carbon partnership. early on, we were interested in really broad biome level questions like, does forest management affect soil carbon at all? In those days, what we did was a literature synthesis and meta-analysis. That's a statistical technique where you synthesize across published studies, embrace all the variation that exists within and between those studies, and to determine whether there is some effect of an intervention, used primarily in the medical sciences for a long time, but brought over to the ecological realm within the last 10 or 20 years. We synthesized hundreds of papers and thousands of response ratios in pursuit of answering that question. And what we found was that, indeed, forest harvesting generally decreases soil carbon. I believe in this case, we had something like 75 papers, a few hundred response ratios calculated from those papers. We found overall a 13% decrease, really driven by losses in the O horizon forest floors, or what we coded those as during that analysis. We found that it was possible to constrain the time scale of recovery of that lost forest floor carbon. And we also found that soil taxonomy was a really useful lens through which to view between study and between site variation. A brief look at soil taxonomy as a framework. We're talking about soil carbon here, not just the vegetation. This is a busy figure. What I'll point out is that we have enough data to assess 4 different soil orders. And they're within each soil order, the unique sources of variation responsible that are driving variation between studies. In particular, I'll note the inceptisols and ultisols were 2 soil orders that showed a general significant decline of soil carbon in that analysis, now almost 10 years old. These are the 2 soil orders that have a lot to do with the results that Kendall and I will be talking about today. These differences that we see between soil orders have a lot to do, or can be readily explained by the properties and processes that drive soil formation in these unique soil orders. So this was the first intimation we had that maybe variation related to soil taxonomy could be the basis for more focused analyses of soil carbon response to management in the future. We published a series of other papers. That harvest study, we also addressed fires, nitrogen inputs, and afforestation. Generally, I would just point out fire and harvest decreases were similar in magnitude and duration. Wildfire was associated with greater soil carbon losses than prescribed fires. Nitrogen additions were apparently a way, there is evidence that that is a way to increase mineral soil carbon, not just organic soil carbon. And one of the things that we return to later, afforestation, increases soil carbon over a multi-decadal time period. 3 generalizations that I would like to make based on these 4 papers. We're taking basically a 100,000-foot view here. First, management does change forest soil carbon, and we can constrain some of those changes over time. Furthermore, it is fundamental ecological, geographic, and pedologic factors are really important. They can prevent, mask, mediate, exacerbate, or even reverse management impacts and the timescales over which they play out. The last of these means that we really need to explicitly incorporate time and place into our assessments. Management does not have the same influence everywhere, and we know the basis for some of that spatial variation and the time scale over which it plays out. How can we do better? Well, we started working with more specific sources of data. We started in the 20-teens to integrate spatially explicit observations. You see the map of points here from International Soil Carbon Network database, which I helped to build. We took those soil observations and overlaid them with remotely sensed data products like the National Land Cover data set. For instance, this figure is showing that from the top down, you see cultivated lands. Those are very readily recognized by satellite imagery. And the soil observation underneath, the profile observation, shows a diagnostic cloud layer, an AP horizon, that results from that cultivation. These things match up very well when we extract the land cover attributes for the distinct points where we have soil observations. A satellite really struggles to differentiate between a forest that's always been a forest, there on the left, and one that results from reforestation on a prior cropland. We use, in this case, the presence of an AP horizon under forest cover to indicate a land that was once cultivated but has been reforested over some unknown time. We've gotten a lot of mileage out of this approach of harmonizing the remote sensing and soil observations. For instance, looking at the distribution of points from the ISCN database, showing where this previously cultivated reforestation is happening more or less. And we were able to use this land use and management comparison of cultivated to reforested to forested, this comparison to really focus on a big bang for the buck type of land use and management in terms of soil carbon. And this is really where the NIAX and American Forest Partnership takes off. And now I can tell you that we have been able to become, by degrees, more specific in our assessments. The first thing we did, we started working with the Forest Service framework called Ecomap, the National System of Ecosystem Classification that breaks the US into successively finer hierarchical ecological units. So broadest level is the domain. We've got the dry domain and the humid domain, primarily climate. Below the domain is the division, and so on. We go down from divisions to provinces to sections and subsections, currently the finest level of resolution available nationally. And in this particular paper, I should say data set, we broke it into a couple different components and published it in 2 papers. We worked at the eco-regional division level. These are hundreds to millions of square kilometers, where it's a combination of climate and vegetation that defines these ecological units. You can see the divisions in the lower left. And what we found was that when we compare these profiles that are either under cultivation, are reforesting after cultivation, or are a natural forest, we see consistent differences indicating some upper limit, some potential for topsoil carbon storage under natural forest. In 5 of 10 divisions, we see a significant increase of reforesting soil carbon relative to the cultivated condition. And in 9 of 10 of these ecoregional divisions, we see the really wide difference between the cultivated condition and the natural forest condition. I'm not going to go into any detail about this table. The point of this slide is to show you a little bit of the math. And of course, you can see this when you, if you're interested in this, you can, of course, look at the paper or this presentation as posted online. What we did was to look at these different ecoregional divisions and assess 2 types of reforestation, that occurring on previously cultivated lands and that occurring where forest is deliberately replanted after some disturbance. We did that using our FIA data and found that per year, 13 to 21 million tons of topsoil carbon are being sequestered in the US per year due to this type of land use and management. This is existing lands undergoing reforestation. That's about 10% of our forest sector carbon sink, and we put a number to it. One benefit of using Ecomap here was we were able to move away from these broad generalizations towards, I'll draw your attention to in the table, the model column. These are accumulation rates that are specific for the different ecoregional divisions of the US. And one of my favorite findings of this analysis was perhaps one of the most mundane, but at the bottom, really a nice validation that the approach works is that we see why reforestation is happening where it's happening. So we're looking at y-axes showing some aspect of soil texture. Clay content on the left, sand content in the middle, stone content on the right. And when you look at the differences in median and quartile differences in these soil textural parameters across the cultivated to reforesting to natural forest condition, you see that wherever you are, cultivated soils are always higher in clay, lower in sand, and lower in stone. People leave forests on the porous soils, and it is those soils that are marginal, that are in between good arable soils and the natural forests that are allowed to undergo reforestation. So another benefit of using that ecoregional approach is we can probe this type of land use dependence on fundamental soil properties. So I would say that after we started to take the ecoregional approach, we improved upon our global and biome level generalizations. And it was helpful to put numbers to the carbon gains possible through activities like reforestation. But that's still a 10,000-foot view, and I think most people would like better resolution than that for informing their projects. So the next step, and where the Forest Soil Carbon Partnership itself really takes off, we downscaled to ecoregional to landscape levels. American Forests obtained funding from SFI, and stakeholders from the state of Maryland were interested in finding out specifically for Maryland, what are the consequences of land use and management on soil carbon stocks. So here, what we did, we combined our meta-analysis approaches, the published literature. In this case, those are the gray dots on this map, locations of published studies where some type of management or land use change was compared with a relatively controlled design. And then we also used our soil profile points, the black triangles, as well as a variety of geospatial data overlays like land cover. And we synthesized those data for the ecoregional sections present in Maryland. And in all cases, extending into adjacent states, because soil carbon doesn't know what state it's in. It's responding to the fundamental geographic factors that follow the geographic delineations you see in a system like Ecomap. These ecoregional sections are finer than the divisions I showed you before. They're based upon vegetation and climate, yes, but also landform, parent material, and soil, factors that really become important when we're talking about soil. As before, we started out with the literature review. I think we ultimately found 24 papers that produced 109 response ratios. We were able to assess the effects of 3 treatments: harvest, fire, and land use change for the study area. Our soil database was 849 profiles, just shy of 5,000 individual horizons. And whereas the literature were biased towards surface soils, our soil observations were, they allowed us to look across a range of depths, including whole soil profiles. One point of this noisy table: both the meta-analysis and the observational approaches agree, left hand and right side. It is the specific treatment or practice that most predicts variation in surface soil carbon. So let's look about these specific treatments. Here on the left, we're looking at meta-analysis findings, treatment effects on soil carbon. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at observational comparisons, soil carbon for O&A horizons under these different land uses. This is just a graphical representation of what I told you last time. And the point I'll make overall is that harvesting generally does not decrease soil carbon. Land use change and fire do. And you can get at some relative specific comparisons on the right-hand panel of this figure. Let's look at harvesting in particular, because those were the most abundant published data. And I'll call attention here on the upper portion. We're looking at, notice on the upper slide, the upper portion of the slide, we're looking at O horizons on the left, A horizons on the right. These are just soil carbon stocks Above the dashed line is from published papers. Below the dashed line is from our soil observations. One puzzling thing we saw was that our raw soil observations tended to have very large O-horizon carbon stocks. A big difference from our synthesized literature data, which showed O-horizons as being much smaller carbon pools. A-horizons, the right-hand panel, no difference between the published estimates and the raw data observations. And an important finding of this research was that whether you're looking at published literature data or raw soil observations, we see carbon stocks in the A-horizon tend to be higher in sloping landforms than on cove or watershed landforms or the ridge slope positions above them. Importantly, the bottom half of this slide shows we also found, in addition to holding more soil carbon, the soil carbon in the sloping landforms is more vulnerable to loss, whether you're looking at O or A horizons. Sloping landforms tend to lose soil carbon after harvesting, whereas ridge and slope landforms combined don't necessarily lose it, and cove or watershed type settings don't lose it and maybe even gain it. Specific practices matter. It's not just where you are, but what you do. There is some slight evidence for more consistent soil carbon declines in the O and the A horizon when residues are removed after harvesting than when they are not. Also, we find on the right-hand side here, replanting is associated with no significant change in soil carbon, where relying on natural regeneration, you see a significant loss of soil carbon. And if you broadcast and burn the residues, that has an influence, something like fire, of a significant decrease in soil carbon. When we're looking at harvesting and land use change, we were able to set a gradient of different disturbance intensity based on the soil profile observations and the remote sensing overlay data. We saw that A horizon carbon storage here on the left tends to be highest in natural forests and harvested forests. Reforestation and cultivated lands are significantly lower carbon in topsoils. And soils that were undergoing reforestation, but then apparently harvested, these have the lowest topsoil carbon stocks of all. And we also used a remotely sensed above ground biomass product and showed some similar and logical patterns in terms of how much biomass carbon is present for these different land conditions. And one thing that we found that I don't show as a scatter plot here was a noisy but significant positive relationship between the amount of above ground biomass and the amount of topsoil carbon. We placed these findings in a soil taxonomic framework. We're looking at a couple of ultisols here on the right. Ultisol is probably the most extensive soil order in the study area. And generally, the only significant difference we see here, lower right-hand panel, natural forests have significantly higher carbon stocks than these other types of forest land use history: cultivation, reforestation, harvesting, or reforested and harvesting. We see in the case of entisols, more significant differences between these land uses. Entisols, which tend to be very young soils, scarcely developed, changing fast, and also tend to be rather fragile because they are so young and their carbon stocks are really being driven by what is coming in terms of carbon inputs. We also assessed some ecoregional patterns, looking at these different ecoregional divisions and the fundamental physiographic differences between them, assessing these different land use history. I think I should, in the interest of time, move through this slide. one of the things I really want to talk about and have a moment to refer to is that we are limited in our ability to detect change by the available literature data and probably by the relative importance of how change happens. We talk about surface horizons, and those are the places where you would logically look to see if there's a change due to harvesting, due to cultivation. But when you assess what controls variation in carbon stocks for just those O and A horizons, those surface organic rich horizons on the left here, this table, versus the full profile, we see a really different set of controlling factors. By and large, we can predict 35, 40% of the variation in how much carbon you find at a place based on some combination of land use and management and fundamental factors like soil taxonomy, soil depth, climate, geographic parameters. But I'll point out that on the left, you see the word land use a lot. That really matters when you're talking about the O and the A horizons. And those really are a small fraction of the total soil carbon held in a full soil profile. On the right, where you see terms like taxonomy, ecoregion, climate, much more important, or relatively more important. And when we look at the whole profile, we start to see just how different these soil orders are, not in terms of their land use. Looking at the upper table, note the general lack of any significant differences indicated by different letters for different rows. Within any given soil order, sure, maybe one land use like wetlands, not surprising, have a lot more soil carbon than others. It's the differences between soil orders. It's the difference between those young, barely different than parent material entasols and the inceptisols of the mountains and the weathered altisols. And another thing that is of note is how much different these soil orders are, not just in terms of how much carbon they store in the whole profile, but how deep those soil profiles tend to be and what proportion of the total profile carbon is in those surface layers. I'll point out one of interest is the spodosol, not very extensive in the study area, restricted to the cold, wet climates of the Alleghenies primarily. Pretty healthy soil carbon stocks, shallow soils, and a lot of that carbon is right at the surface. Contrast that with something like an altisol, a well-weathered soil, plenty of them in the mountains, half the soil carbon, twice as deep, and a depth distribution that runs rather deep. So this was the basis, really, looking at how these soil orders differed in their amount of soil carbon, how it's distributed with depth, and how deep the profiles are, for starting to think about the vulnerability of these different soil orders to physical soil disturbance. And that is where I make the handoff to Kendall, and we talk about, Kendall will now discuss the work that she's been leading as part of the Forest Soil Carbon Partnership to assess what these scientific results mean for policy and management. And
thanks, Luke.
Slides for Kendall.
All right, do you mind switching to the next slide, please? Perfect. So as Luke just said, the next big step in this whole project is really to use all this great science and all this great data to inform forest management decisions and even forest and climate policy. So to accomplish this, we've been working with the Maryland DNR Forest Service to synthesize our results in a way that is useful for the agency's forest management objectives. And in the bigger picture, we're tapping into the Natural and Working Lands work group of the U.S. Climate Alliance to think about the link between our research and state climate action. So more on that in a little bit, but first, let's remind ourselves why we even care about forest soil carbon. So why soil carbon? Our group chose to focus on this for a few reasons. First is that soil is the largest carbon pool for most land cover classes in the US, and that includes forests, wetlands, ag land, grassland, you name it. In forests specifically, soils can store up to 70% or sometimes more of the carbon that you find in that entire ecosystem. So that is a lot of carbon, and that's a pretty big pool with lots of potential for climate benefits. But soil carbon is really seldom included in climate mitigation goals. Just the other day, I was on a call with some folks from the California Air Resources Board, and they said that soil had not really been considered in their offset projects because it's just too complicated to figure out with any certainty. So that means that there's a big opportunity here to think about the ways that forest management impacts soil carbon and the ways we can use forest management to protect and enhance our soil carbon stocks in the US. Doing this can ultimately help us minimize our forest carbon losses, increase the forest carbon sink, combat climate change, and meet our climate goals. It sounds easy, right? But to help Maryland accomplish these goals, we are working with our DNR partners to create a decision support tool in the form of a quote-unquote stoplight map. So essentially, this will take what we know about the relationship between management and soil carbon and categorize it in a way that we can map areas of the state that are most likely to be vulnerable to losing their soil carbon stocks, or areas where we could see significant soil carbon gains from management, especially from reforestation. So the stoplight piece of this comes in because we'll characterize areas of the state as either green, yellow, or red to indicate their levels of vulnerability and how cautious managers should be about their soil carbon. Here we're defining vulnerability as the physical tendency of the soil to lose its soil carbon, regardless of how much it currently has. Whereas mapping opportunity is more an exercise in finding areas where soil carbon is low compared to areas with physical characteristics that are similar. So the soil there has the physical potential to hold more soil carbon, and we could use some management practices to help it hold more of that carbon. Next slide, please. So to create this stoplight map, we need to identify which are the most important factors influencing soil carbon. And as Luke just told us earlier, our research found that specific treatments and practices are the most significant predictors of variation in soil carbon in both of our types of analyses. So that means that this list of important factors will depend on what's happening on the land, and especially whether the land is covered by forests or wetlands or agriculture or something else. So for existing forests that are being managed in some way, we know that topography, landform, especially slope, is the most important variable influencing the response in soil carbon. And next comes soil order. Soil horizon is significant because most of the action and the vulnerability takes place in those soils right at the surface, in the top 10 centimeters. For reforestation, we're more concerned with identifying areas of recent forest loss or gain, because disturbing recovering forests can negate any soil carbon gains from reforestation. And this is a problem of compound disturbances that don't allow the soil to accumulate much carbon. Similarly, areas with recent forest loss present an opportunity to recover and protect their soil carbon stocks if they're replanted. For wetlands, we're also more interested in recent land use changes and basically limiting those compound disturbances in restored wetlands. So these three different sets of factors will lead us to three different mapping products, which we can then compile into one monster stoplight map, or we can keep them separate to isolate certain factors of interest. And this is still a work in progress, so I won't walk you through everything today, but we will talk about these factors affecting that first category of forest responses to management. Next slide, please. So you'll recall from the previous slide that topography, and especially slope, is the most important factor in determining soil carbon vulnerability. So the first variable to map across our study area is going to be slope. We did this using slope classes from NRCS that are based on percent slope, and we combined them into three broad categories. So a nearly level to gently sloped lands, moderately sloped lands, and then steep slopes. And we know that steep slopes are more vulnerable to soil disturbances, erosion, and other things that make their soil carbon more vulnerable. And so they show up in the darker orange here on this map to illustrate that greater vulnerability. Next slide, please. Okay, so next we came up with a soil order vulnerability score based on profile depth, soil carbon stocks, and soil carbon stock depth distribution. This is what Luke was just talking about that gave us the idea to start looking at soil order as an important variable. And essentially, since we know that most of the action is in topsoils, most of the vulnerability is there, then soil orders with shallower profiles or a greater concentration of soil carbon stocks right at the top in their topsoils are more vulnerable to losing what soil carbon they have. So those soil orders like spodosols or inceptisols show up in the darker orange here because of their higher vulnerability. Now, it may seem hard to tell the difference between these variables when we have them separated in different maps like this. So the next step is to add them together in a weighted vulnerability score. And we can do this by assigning each vulnerability category with a numerical score and then basically just adding them together in a weighted sum. And we weighted this final score because slope and soil order are not equally important in determining soil carbon vulnerability. We know from our research that slope is a more important variable, so that slope class gets more weight in the final vulnerability score. So let's take a look at what it actually looks like when we put it together. Next slide, please. So here's a draft version of our final vulnerability score, color-coded per our stoplight theme, where green areas indicate areas with lower vulnerability and red indicates higher vulnerability to soil carbon loss. This is limited to areas of existing forest, so the gray areas in the map here are not forested, and they will be considered in one of our other mapping products that I mentioned earlier that have more to do with reforestation and land use change. Now, I know it may seem immediately alarming to look at some of those very red areas, like the Southern Appalachians. But if you think about it, those are the most mountainous parts of our study area, and some of them do have some pretty steep slopes. So given the importance of slope as a factor in soil carbon vulnerability, it makes sense that the mountain areas would show up as more vulnerable here. I'd like to say at this point that these colors don't mean that we absolutely can't touch forests in those red areas. This is just meant to indicate areas where soil carbon is probably going to be lost from forest management, such as harvesting or fire. And we'd like managers to be aware of that and to decide if they can take any actions to mitigate some of these losses. Conversely, just because an area shows up as green doesn't mean that soil carbon can't be lost, just may be less vulnerable there. This map might also look different if we changed our weighting scheme. So for example, if we gave slope class and soil order equal importance, or if we'd assigned different numbers to each of the preliminary vulnerability classes. So Luke and I have basically taken a first stab at calculating this score, but this is where we need to connect with our Maryland Forest Service partners who have key local knowledge of their forests and their soils and work together to refine this score. So I think this is pretty cool to look at over our entire study area. But it's not really very helpful for informing on-the-ground management, which is ultimately what we're aiming for. So we can zoom in a little bit more and explore more of the detail in this map. Next slide, please. So when we zoom into Maryland, we can start to see some interesting trends. Some patches of high vulnerability in the mountains where there are steeper slopes, lots of green areas in the coastal plain, and a reminder that the gray here is not forest, so we're not worrying about that in this stage of our map, but those areas will be considered later on. So at a state level, this might be useful for overall scoping of relative soil carbon vulnerability, and we might be able to recommend that maybe forest managers in Western Maryland do some thinking about whether their soil carbon is vulnerable to management activities. But we're really not still at that level of detail that plugs into management decisions. So let's go ahead and zoom in even more. Next slide, please. Now, we're finally getting to a level of detail that might be useful for a manager. This comparison of two state forests, Green Ridge State Forest in Western Maryland and Cedarville State Forest in the eastern part of the state show how these classifications and vulnerability scores can vary by location and topography, as they should. And this is beginning to show us useful detail. Like you can see some areas with locally steep slopes, or maybe some shallower and more vulnerable soils. And we could also separate this map into its different components of slope and soil order to look at each factor by itself. We can also keep zooming in even further because each pixel in this map covers about 10 meters on the ground. So there's a lot of detail still to be explored here. And this is where our unique approach to this project really allows us to downscale global or national level data sets and interpret this science at a level that can actually be useful for forest management. So for example, we can take these vulnerability maps and compare them to current management prescriptions in any of these state forests. And we can think about areas where current management either aligns well with protecting soil carbon stocks, or where it might change a bit if we were considering soil carbon as another management objective. And this is where having a willing partner on the ground, like the Maryland DNR Forest Service, is really crucial to the overall success of this project. Because to use this science to inform forest management, which is our ultimate goal, we need a partner that's open to incorporating our results in their decision-making process, even if it means things might change a bit from the status quo. And keep in mind that this is only one of the mapping products we'll create. The other two have to do with land use change and restoration opportunities for forests and wetlands. So once we put them all together, we'll have a map identifying areas of vulnerability and opportunity for soil carbon throughout our study area with a good amount of detail, which we envision being used as just one input in a larger forest or land management decision-making process. Next slide, please. So what's next? Our first objective from here is to fine-tune this map with Maryland DNR staff, working to calibrate our vulnerability scores with what they know from their on-the-ground expertise. And we'll also have a discussion about how best to provide this information so that it can be useful in decision-making in the future. Whether that's an online map, a shared data set, a bunch of snapshots of state forests like what I showed you today, or any other format that we can think of that might be useful. We'd also like to do this again, or we are going to do this again, in other states and other parts of the country, both to help those states with their forest management decisions, but also to see if the results found in Maryland are actually borne out in other areas and other forest types. And this is where we're hoping to really utilize the Natural and Working Lands Work Group of the U.S. Climate Alliance, because we know that the states involved in this group already have some political momentum and have demonstrated some willingness to consider management practices that protect and enhance the forest carbon sink, which should definitely include soils. So from this process, we should be able to identify a set of beneficial soil carbon practices that can be adapted and applied on a regional level or maybe even all over the country. We can also identify some policy levers and possible financial mechanisms to encourage these practices to scale up across large areas and landscapes so that we're having a bigger impact. And again, this speaks to the importance of willing on-the-ground partners and the incredible opportunity to tap into the Climate Alliance to scale this up. And we hope that by doing this, we can help protect and enhance our forest soil carbon stocks and help forests fully realize their potential as a crucial climate mitigation tool. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and open it up to questions via the chat box.
Super. Thank you, Kendall and Luke. This is Dave Cleves. In our remaining time, we'd like to move into the Q&A session of this webinar. And we've been looking at our chat feature and the email, and we'll start with the questions that have come in already. In the meantime, please remember to submit your questions in the chat box, or you can submit a question by email to forestc@msu.edu, and Laura and Lucas will pick those up. If we don't get to your question in time, we'll be sure to connect you via email following the webinar, connect with you via email. So I'll go to the Q&A box first, and we have 3 questions lined up. Number 1, and I'll send this to Luke. Can you explain the difference between the O and A horizons in soil, please?
Yeah. O horizons are surface organic matter accumulation, at least 40% organic matter, 20% organic carbon. A horizons are the organic rich mineral surface horizon, less than 40% organic matter, less than 20% organic carbon. Sometimes difficult to differentiate in the field, especially if soils are mixed by soil fauna, but we would expect them to respond generally similar to management because they tend to be fairly shallow horizons in the area of interest. We're talking 5 to 10 centimeters on average. And also because their structure is so sensitive to physical disturbances, their structure in large part being driven by those high organic matter concentrations.
Okay, super. Second question, can you say something about how long it takes on average for harvested natural forest, reforested land, and cultivated land to regain the soil organic carbon levels of natural forest? So I'll open that up to both of our speakers, and they can answer that in coordination, however they would like to.
Okay. You know, it's really hard to put a number to that, even in a generalization. At the continental scale, I actually don't think anyone can answer that question. Anyone who does, you ought to be suspicious of them, primarily because this type of land use change has not had long enough to play out to recover. I think when we're talking about reforestation after cultivation, it's probably centuries, at least many decades. Within the area of this study, within Maryland, it may be shorter, given that those topsoils appear to be responding to surface organic inputs, and we have very productive forests in this part of the world. But I would say generally for reforestation after cultivation, we're probably talking centuries. If we're talking about fires and harvesting, it's probably decades to a century.
Okay. Right. Another question, Kendall, this is headed your way. Kendall mentioned talking to ARB, Air Resource Board, California, I'm assuming here, about the compliance considerations for carbon and forest offset projects. Have you had any discussions with voluntary markets, American Carbon Registry, for example? And how might the vulnerability and opportunity maps be useful in these markets in the absence of solid quantification methods?
Hey, Keiki, thanks for the question. The short answer is that no, we haven't really talked to voluntary carbon markets at all. And that's not a primary focus of this project at this point. I just, since working on this project, anytime I hear soil pop up, I pay more attention to it now. So I noticed on the call with the California ARB folks the other day that they talked about how soil was a little bit too difficult to quantify. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for trying to figure out how to plug this map and our data in to something that doesn't need the rigor of a compliance offset. So the short answer is we haven't really thought about it yet, but if you have some ideas, I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Okay, I'm going to shift over because there's a very similar question over in the chat box, and then sticking with thematically here. So Kendall, don't leave your seat yet. So you mentioned that the California Offset Program does not treat soils. And are you aware of other forest carbon accounting systems that do a good job of incorporating both the above and below ground carbon? This is in the chat box.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of voluntary market protocols similar to the California Compliance Protocol that do a good job of accounting for the carbon in trees, both above and below ground. I'm not aware of one that really incorporates soil in any kind of meaningful way, at least for forests. I know there are people working on this more in the ag space because there's been more of a push for ag soil health. But I think a lot of that is just because soils are incredibly variable. There's a lot of local and site level variation that's really difficult to model in any kind of platform or program that you would need for your forest carbon accounting and for projections. So part of what we're hoping, and I think part of what Keki's question was getting at, was that maybe we can use these kind of maps to not quantify the changes to a number in soil carbon from certain management practices, but at least we know directionality. We know that certain practices will help us increase soil carbon, certain practices will probably lose it. We know some ways that we can help recover some of the soil carbon that's been lost. And I think that's probably as specific as we can get now, but we're looking for more ways to fine tune those recommendations even more, and hoping that maybe by analyzing this over multiple regions of the country that we might be able to get some more specific recommendations.
Okay, fantastic, great. Okay, next question back in the Q&A box. Can you say something about invasive species effects on soil carbon? If invasive understory effects on native tree species, how to handle the management of that?
Well, I can say that somebody should do a literature review and meta-analysis of that very topic, because I do not know the answer to that question.
Okay, so that sounds like next steps for someone. And I'm looking at forests here in Maryland that just have a whole load of Japanese stilt grass, and I wonder what it's doing to the carbon and everything else in the forest. So very good question. If we'll dig around a little bit to see if there's any clues out there. Next question, can this data indicators and inputs, can these data indicators and inputs be replicated in soils located in the tropics? So whoever wants to field that one.
Well, I can take a first stab. I'll keep it brief because I want to hear what Kendall has to say. I think that our approach and the way that we have used data would work anywhere that data exists. And I think that it could also be done in the tropics. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks, Johnny, for the question. We definitely couldn't take anything that we found in Maryland and apply it to the tropics, but I would agree if there were the same sets of data with published studies and soil profile information that we could use, then I think we could probably figure out something for any region where there's enough data to crunch it.
Okay, fantastic. Question, a comment here, actually coming in from Michael Smith. Kendall, if you'd like some connections to CAR, let me know. So this is an offer coming in here. They have a voluntary soil carbon protocol that might be of interest. So let me shift over now to the chat box. I noticed there were a couple of coming in there. Have any of your studies looked at effects, if any, on soil organic carbon from frozen ground operations?
Well, I have never been able to review that literature systematically. I'm aware of some excellent research on that topic done in areas of the country where operations are, in some cases limited entirely to periods of frozen ground. But no, I've never addressed that in my own research or my synthesis of others' research.
Okay, and now we're back to Q&A box. Can you map soil organic carbon under different species classes and see how these compare for similar topography, slope, soil order, and horizon.
My quick answer is Kendall can do anything with the GIS.
Yeah, I think this again comes down to a data question. And a lot of what we were using for remote sensing data was a combination of an LCD and gap land cover. So depending on how specific you wanted to get with different species classes, if there's a large scale data set that has it, then we can figure out how to incorporate it.
And this gives me maybe a little opportunity just to jump briefly on a soapbox. And this is as a person who came to an appreciation for soils from the trees. I think that it would be worth, in an exercise like this, looking at whether tree species mattered at all in the first place before assuming that it was a good basis for mapping. One of the things I keep coming back to in my analyses of soil carbon is that it's mostly about the soil. The vegetation you happen to have on that soil at some point in time is usually less important than the properties of the soil from the bottom up. And there's definitely good examples, especially at fine scales, where species matter, species have influences. But I would suspect that if we look at scales like we have been able to thus far, biomes, ecoregions, even down to landscapes, where we see relationships between species and soil carbon, the species are probably responding to something else that is directly influencing soil carbon at that landscape scale.
Great. Okay, folks, I see us, it looks about right straight at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much. I think this is particularly exciting for me because I'm now witnessing, if you will, the potential of bringing soil carbon into more of a kind of a full-blown risk-based investment approach. So thanks so much for our speakers, our guests, Luke and Kendall, and I'd like to thank the members of the Forest Climate Working Group and the Forest Climate Working Group Steering Committee for their support as we kick off this new series for the Learning Exchange. And as you look ahead, our next session will be on November 6th. It's always the first Wednesday, and that will be Federal Policy Outlook for Forest, Carbon, and Climate. So we'd like to see you all on the participants list next time. Just remember that the webinar recording and any supplemental material will be posted within a few days. And if you would like to get registration details or information regarding these webinars, or if you have second thoughts or questions that pop in your mind about this one, go to forestc@msu.edu. Thanks again to Lauren Cooper and Lauren Lucas, who navigated us through this and who did the wonderful job of planning this whole series. So with that, we'll adjourn and we'll see you back on November 6th. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.